In my last two videos I talked about using telephoto lenses on my Lumix G9. In one case a Nikon fit lens via an adapter which gave me longer reach but at the expense of no autofocus, and in the other case a Lumix 100 to 300 which gave me shorter reach but full autofocus. Those pictures were taken fairly recently to give me a break from landscape photography when the weather wasn't great, but it got me to thinking about the potential benefits and disadvantages of micro four thirds when it came to focal length range. Now the big advantage for micro four thirds with the cropping factor is that it gives you the potential for greater reach with lighter lenses, and the disadvantage of micro four thirds in that it gives you greater depth of field is less of an issue at telephoto end because your depth of field tends to be more limited anyway, so you still have the potential to some extent to blur out backgrounds. At the other end, at the wide angle end, the issue is a little bit more problematic for micro four thirds. You're going to have more depth of field, which is probably not an issue unless you're talking about portraits, but for landscapes it's not really going to be a problem. But where you do have a problem is getting the really wide angle range of view. And if you look around at what's available, there is a Laowa at 7.5mm, which with the cropping factor gives you equivalent full frame of 15mm, and there's a few Panasonic and Olympus zooms from 7mm, 8mm upwards. So you're pretty much stuck around the 14 to 15mm at the wider end. Now from my point of view, I can't really justify the expense of let's call it an ultra wide angle lens. I can't really justify the expense of that based on the amount of usage I give to that sort of focal length range. Back in the day, when I was still using Nikon APS-C, I bought a Sigma 10 to 20mm, which with the cropping factor at the widest end gave me 15mm. And I did that very specifically because I was moving house and I was looking to take the brochure pictures myself rather than leave them to the estate agent. And I wanted to take interior shots. And that lens gave me the potential to do that. The disadvantage was, back then, and we're talking 6-7 years ago, Sigma weren't making the high-end glass that they're making now, and that was a lens of fairly average performance, good enough for my needs, but really not top class. But apart from taking brochure pictures, I use that lens very rarely. But I did want the potential to have the option of using wide angle or ultra wide angle lenses on my micro four thirds. Now, the widest angle lens that I've got in a native Lumix micro four thirds fit is the 12 to 32 short telephoto zoom, which gives me 24mm at the widest end. And for most of my use that's fine. But to go wider than that, I would need to put my Nikon lens on adapter, or I would need to buy this bespoke lens. If I just use a straight adapter with the cropping factor, my Sigma lens would give me 20mm at the widest angle. An improvement, but not much. And so that led me to look at speed boosters. Now, I'm sure many of you are familiar with speed boosters, but for those that are not, they're basically a teleconverter in reverse. They were introduced, first of all, I believe, by a company called Metabones, and the standard is that they will give you a 0.7 times magnification at the benefit of a gain of a stop of light, whereas a teleconverter will give you a 1.4 times magnification at the cost of a stop of light. So if we take my Sigma lens, 10mm multiplied by 0.71, that gives me 7.1mm, cropping factor of 2, that gives me 14.2mm focal length. So with a speed booster I actually get slightly better a wider field of view than on my Nikon APS-C camera. The problem is that the Metabones speed booster for a Nikon to Micro Four Thirds conversion would cost me about £450, which is not a lot different to a Laowa prime 7.5mm lens. So it wasn't a very attractive option, but there is an alternative. There's a Chinese company called Viltrox who make a similar specification speed booster for around £80. In fact, I got mine a couple of years ago for a little less than that. Now this is completely manual, like the straight adapter, but at £75, £80, it's only about a quarter of the price, or a fifth of the price of the Metabones. The reviews suggest that although the performance isn't as good, it's not as bad as that differential in price would suggest. So for 75 quid, I decided I'd buy one and have a play. And what I wanted to show in the rest of this video is some shots that I got with the this combination, the Sigma and the Viltrox. And just to show it here, this is what we've got. It's fairly bulky compared with Micro Four Thirds, so what I'm sacrificing, which is quite a lot in terms of bulk, so I won't be using my lightweight travel tripod that I was using with the 100 to 300. Now, the picture I'm going to show was taken in 2020. That was before I got my Lumix G9, so these pictures that I'm going to show were taken on a Lumix GX9. So what I'm going to do now is jump over into post-processing, show you the pictures and show you what I achieved, particularly focusing on image quality. Okay, so here we have the pictures that I took, and just to give a bit of context to this shoot, I had something specific in mind here. The big thing with ultra wide angle lenses is they give you the potential to accentuate the foreground and to change the relative significance of foreground elements to background elements. I'm going to skim through these fairly quickly. Taken handheld because it's a fairly bright day. I did push the ISO up a bit, but I wanted the flexibility to move around because the cows are constantly moving around. But I really wanted the cows really close to get the context of the cows in the house. By using the ultra wide angle lens, I am magnifying the effect on the cows with respect to the house. So the house is reduced in size, the cows are emphasized or magnified. So I'm not trying to move too much because I don't really want them focusing too much on me. I want them grazing and doing what they do naturally. The one in the middle here is a very big bull, and I'm probably no more than 10 or 15 feet away from it. So while in a lot of my videos I talk about taking pictures with my dog, today I did not have a dog. I did not want the dog aggravating this guy. Fortunately, he's very placid. And seeing him interact with the farmer, he really is a very mild-mannered animal. But even so, he's big and you don't want to mess with him. Okay, so this is the one I'm going to concentrate on because it's got a reasonable orientation of the cows and it's got the house in the background. But the story here is the cows. The house is the context, and this really was the relationship that I had. I have got some texture in the sky which I'm going to look to bring out in post-processing. Okay, so here we are in DxO Photolab 5. This is the image straight out of the camera, no corrections applied at all. If I now go to color, I'm going to set the white balance to daylight, and that's pretty much how I remember the scene. Now, if I turn on the highlights and the shadows indicator, I'll clip the shadows. But these cows are pretty dark and they're in shadow here, so I think really those shadows should be clipped. So I'm going to pull the blacks down until I just start to see an area starting to clip in the deepest shadows. There won't be any detail in there. I really want to get the biggest tonal range possible. I'm then going to push up the shadows to bring out more of the coat in the cows. Now I've got the sky being very bright here. We just pull the exposure down just to see how much detail there is in there. You see there's a reasonable amount of detail. I'm going to use a mask here, a local adjustment, and I am going to use a control line. And what I'm going to do here, the transition isn't particularly critical because I'm going for the highlights here, and I'm going to pick an area of sky, and what I'm trying to do is create a mask of the sky and using that as a reference point. And I can check what the mask looks like. Let's go for M for mask. And now I can adjust in this menu here what I've got. So if I change the luminosity, and I can change the chroma, the color, and by changing the color I can eliminate the house because I don't want to dim down the house. So now I've got a reasonable mask for my sky. Click M again to take the mask off, and now I can go in here and I can drop the exposure, see what that looks like. Obviously you can easily go too far here, or I can try dropping the highlights. And this is just a bit of playing around. And the other thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to use the Clear View Plus, which is the haze removal for DxO Photo Lab, but it also does some local contrast adjustments. So it just pulls out a little bit of detail in the sky. So I'm reasonably happy with that. Now the sky was a bit bluer than this, so if we go to colour and I pick the here, just need to click this twice for some reason, and I can change the hue here by rotating these control points here and playing around to choice, and I can increase the saturation, and I can play around with the luminosity a bit to play with it. And again, I can go back and forth just to see how I've changed the image. This was a bright August day, so I think that's much more representative of the sky that I had. So now I'm going to export that into Photoshop. I'm going to use a deep prime noise reduction because I have lifted some of the shadow areas just to take out any noise that we've got. And I'm going to export that to Photoshop. Okay, here we are in Photoshop. But what I want to concentrate on is to bring out this coat texture. So again, just zoom in. It's a little bit soft and blurred in. I think really for web use, which is mainly what I had in mind, this would be fine. But if I wanted to get something a little bit larger, then I need to do some work on that. So first thing I'm going to do is create a new layer, Control J, and then I'm going to select Topaz Labs Sharpen AI. Right, okay, now I've got a range of options here: motion blur, normal, motion blur, very noisy, motion, so out of focus, and really this was taken at a 400th of a second, so at a wide angle lens. There isn't going to be any motion blur in here. It's very unlikely unless a cow was whipping around extremely fast, so I think we can ignore those. Out of focus, no, the lens was stopped down via the Viltrox adapter. The stopping down doesn't translate exactly to f-stop, so I can't give you an exact aperture. But it's not like to be out of focus. Pretty much got front to back focus. But what it is soft, and I would say it's very blurry, and that's really a reflection of the combination of the lens and the adapter, and that's what I've got chosen here. Too soft, very blurry. And if you look at the two, you can see that it brought out quite a lot more detail in the cow. And if you compare the windows of the building, again, you can see that's much sharper. So it's just redoing that because I scrolled around, and this will highlight again much more clearly the windows in the sharpened to the unsharpened and the coat texture. So I'm going to apply that now, and that will then take me back to Photoshop. And now we can look, zooming in, look at coat texture. Well, you can't see individual hairs, but we have got some texture. We've got some texture in the grass. Now you can decide whether or not this is overdone, and you can go back to the rerun Topaz AI. But the other thing you've got here is you can change the opacity of this layer in Photoshop, so we can take out that sharpening completely, or we can just gradually dial it up until we get to a point where we're satisfied with it. Turn it on and off. So with this combination, I've really managed to come away with some reasonable images that clearly benefit from some careful post-processing. But for my £75 expenditure, I think that's really not too bad. Just one technical point that I would make here. If you look into the Viltrox lens, and if you buy one, you will need to adjust the infinity focus. Several YouTube videos showing how to do that. Safeguarding caveat there: if you are not careful with your adjustments, it is possible to adjust too far, such that the element in the Viltrox could actually foul on the rear element of your telephoto lens. So do take a little bit of care there. Well, I hope you found this interesting. I hope you found it potentially useful. And once again, thanks for watching and goodbye.